the talks are always about the same topic, and there is repetition. It is repeated because it's understood. It's understood that repetition is needed. It's not the sort of information that we can hear once and understand, and then the misunderstanding will fall away. So we'll just check what the technical issue is. 1 second. Can you do it again? So the talks are always about the same topic in general. And that topic is happiness for the human being in daily living. And happiness is our birthright. Happiness is available to us in this life. It's our very essence, our very nature. And happiness that is available, and by happiness I mean a continuous, unbroken happiness, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. That happiness that I'm speaking about is very clearly not a happiness through pleasure, 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 but happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind. And what is peace of mind? Peace of mind isn't a feeling. Feelings would fit more into the category of pleasure or pain. If it was a feeling, then it would be the addition of this feeling. It would be the coming in of this feeling. And much more accurately, the happiness that is available, continuous, unbroken peace of mind, is the ending of, the absence of suffering. The first noble truth in Buddhism, and not that this is Buddhism, but just to point to the path. And the Buddha put forward 4 noble truths. And the way I see the 4 noble truths is a way of describing a process and a movement from the first noble truth to the second noble truth to the third noble truth and the fourth noble truth. And the first noble truth is the realization, the recognition that life is suffering. That is essentially the birth of the seeker. That's not to say that suffering wasn't there before. It's just that the seeking for pleasure, the addiction towards pleasure, tended to cover it up, tended to distract the suffering. And at a point where the suffering makes itself so well known that there is a realization that suffering is an inherent part of life. That's when seeking kicks in. And the seeking is a seeking for the end of suffering, whether we know it or not at that time. And so when I say that the first noble truth is realized when there is the recognition that suffering is an inherent part of life, it would seem like peace of mind, which is the end of suffering, is not available in this life if suffering is an inherent part of life. However, it is, because what I'm speaking about by life is the experience of life as it arises in each moment. And suffering is an inherent component of life only when the human being is a certain way. When the human being has certain deeply ingrained beliefs that turn into a psychological identity, which is the standard way that the human being develops in life, then a consistent attitude to life exists, an attitude that stems from this psychological identity. And that psychological identity essentially forces life to be suffering. It means there is no freedom from suffering while the psychological identity exists. And because it developed at a very young age in the human being, it's been there and it's been interpreting life and essentially turning the life experience, which is a combination of the flow of life, which we can say is the biological aspect of the life experience, and the psychological identity infuses the biological layer of life with this suffering. And so the suffering becomes essentially part and parcel of the experience of life. And that's why it is said that life is suffering. What it really means is life lived through a certain lens is experienced as suffering. And because that lens, that psychological identity has been there consistently, when we realize the suffering that is inherent in life, we will say, it's always been here. It doesn't ever seem to leave. Now, that suffering can exist in many different forms, mild to intense, and mild to intense in different expressions of suffering. So not everyone is going to experience the same suffering. Not everyone is going to experience the same intensity either. So there's different forms of suffering and different intensities. And so for a lot of people, the suffering is, in a sense, a mild that we get used to. And so when I say there is a realization, a recognition that life is suffering, some people might say, well, it's not really that bad. And so this life is suffering doesn't mean that we are living life in absolute turmoil, where there is this heavy blanket of depression or anxiety on us, for example. That will be some people's suffering. And so for some people, life is suffering is a realization that life is infused with a very heavy layer of suffering. But for some other people, the suffering takes a much milder form. And yet even the mild form, once it's realized, will be seen to be this uncomfortableness that is basically always there because the person is always there. So we can't ever outrun the uncomfortableness. The second noble truth is understanding that there is a way out of suffering. So coming to hear that peace of mind, happiness for the human being in this life, which takes the form of unbroken peace of mind, is available, is a very important milestone for a seeker. For that to be heard and for there to be some resonance with, yes, I feel somewhere in my system that this is true. It's your birthright. It's a result of your very essence. What this means is that what it means when we say it's available for everyone. It's your birthright. It doesn't mean everyone is actually going to end up being happy. But what it says is that no one is missing anything for happiness to set in. If a human is conscious, and all humans that are experiencing life, anyone who can see the 5 fingers on my hand, if we're going to be technical about this, 4 fingers and a thumb. I'm sure someone goes, you don't have 5 fingers on your hand. Anyone who's aware of my hand is conscious. There must be consciousness flowing through the human being in order for the hand to be registered, recognized, aware. The function, one of the basic functions of consciousness is awareness. So if there is awareness of sounds, of the experience of life, if there is awareness of any of the components of life, any of the sensory components of life, or the internal awareness of thoughts, of feelings, then the essence of the human being is there. The essence has to be there in order for us to be alive, experiencing life. And that is all that is needed in order for happiness to be present. So no one is missing anything. So the unhappiness is there because we have additional stuff that is not needed. And if we're talking about peace of mind, happiness, it's additional stuff that must fall away. And so the falling away is not in our control. It may or may not happen, which is why, even though it's our birthright, because our essence is by nature not prone to suffer. When I say our essence, I don't mean the human being, but the essence that flows through the human being. So even if it's our birthright, it doesn't mean that it is going to set in. Nonetheless, even though it's the very act of life delivering the information to us that happiness for the human being is available is already a very good sign that that which is not in our control is in motion. And we really need to start receiving more and more information of this sort from life. Another of the really significant points is that our unhappiness is always attitudinal to circumstance. Our unhappiness is a layer of our experience that is not the layer of circumstance, but rather the attitude that arises towards the circumstance. And so what is the basis of this attitude to circumstance that turns into suffering? What is the attitude that we have that leads to suffering? And the answer is, it's the attitude of personal doership and the attitude of attachment to outcomes. And that attitude is forced to be there because the identity that I spoke of earlier was put in place. And that psychological identity is, when we really start seeing it dissolve, we realize it's made up of belief. It's made up of beliefs that have been ingrained in us as a result of our experience of life, as a result of not only the experience in the different circumstances that happen, but the way that the actual experience of time and space and the experience of being a body in time and space arise moment after moment. And so that very experience of being a person in a world of time and space, experiencing events which are pleasurable and painful, feeling like I am the one that caused that to happen, or seeing the other as the cause of it, because on the surface, that really is how life feels and seems. So being in life forces the psychological identity to form. And that psychological identity then forces the attitude to life to be there. We can't not have an attitude towards life if that psychological identity is there. And we didn't put it there. It grew just like the thorns on a rose bush grow, or the hair on our head grows, and we don't make it happen. The psychological identity grew. It just was part of the package. And so now the attitude towards life is part of the package, part of the experience, the overall experience that arises. And very often, because the experience of life arises as one big experience, and we don't even look at it as an experience arising, it's so consistently the way we know life, that every morning we wake up into the same experience of life, and more or less the same experience of life, and we go through the day more or less experiencing life the same way, and we may never question the fact that there are these different layers of circumstance and attitude to circumstance. And if we don't question that, if it doesn't become clear, then all we have is the final product in each moment that we know as my life experience. And when the attitude of attachment and doership is in place, it will feel like it is all about the circumstance, because the attitude is an attitude towards circumstance. And so what is happening in each moment is the circumstance and an attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes to circumstance, which aren't seen or felt as two layers. So the one end product arises, which is what we know as our life experience. And the attitude and the circumstance to be one thing. So the uncomfortableness, the suffering, which is always attitude to circumstance, seems like it's because of circumstance. And because that's the case, the doership and attachment to outcomes gets further ingrained, which forces our attitude to be an attitude that is always trying to control circumstance to maximize circumstance. Control circumstance to make circumstance pleasure, 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 because our whole life has been a product, an experience that says my uncomfortableness is there primarily because of circumstance. So the strategy that sets in is one of changing circumstance. Believing that if I finally get the mix of circumstance right, then everything will be okay. And it doesn't matter how you restructure the circumstance. If the same attitude exists, the same uncomfortableness will pervade the life experience, and we will continue to get frustrated thinking, what is it that I have to change? You might even be extremely fortunate where your life circumstance improves immeasurably. And so the life circumstance improving should, according to how we've assessed life and what we've concluded about, okay, my suffering can come to an end now. And in fact, we'll find that it won't. Even with very improved circumstance, the suffering persists because it's about our attitude to circumstance. And so while we're busy trying to change circumstance, convinced that that's where the solution will be, that happiness will come when everyone is loving to each other, when everyone is loving to me, when the environment is looked after, when we stop hurting other people and other creatures in life, when I have to work less, when we can travel again, then I'll be happy. So for as long as our energy is going into that, it's not going into focusing on the attitude. And as soon as our system starts to receive enough information that sinks in, our attention might start changing onto the attitude. And as attention looks onto a new area or looks on new, when that aspect can actually change. So in being convinced that the problem is circumstance, the real problem remains unchanged. Because in order for problems to be solved, problems to change, it requires awareness. It requires a seeing, an understanding. And that understanding, that seeing, by default means things start to change in that area. Whereas if attention is elsewhere, they tend to remain unchanged. Sometimes, often, actually being reinforced. So one of the things that I mentioned a few days ago, and it's come up in conversations with some people, is that the world, my experience of life, is that life is quite amazing, quite beautiful. And yet there are accounts from many people that, what is this world coming to? That the world is filled with X, Y, and Z. And when I hear these accounts, I go, wow, that's not my world. Those things don't exist in my world. Now, I'm not trying to say to people, that's island somewhere has all, extremely extreme differences to the world in which you live. What I'm suggesting is that don't get me wrong, there are going to be some people that in their life, and a lot of people in the world, but this isn't about what's out there so much. This particular topic is about happiness for the human being, and happiness for the human being is the end of suffering, which means something very present here in the present moment experience of life. And so for some people, life might include starvation and rapes and violence. But for many people, those are concepts that are overlaid into the present moment experience of life, overlaid by thinking about stories that we've been told about the past, thinking about events that have happened in the past that are kept alive through memory, thinking about other places in the present moment that theoretically exist in the world. And when I say theoretically, that means that they exist according to a description we've been given, and they may exist actually. They, for all intents and purposes, would say, well, war in Syria, for example, exists actually, but it's not our direct experience right now for most of us. And so when we are continually thinking about that, then it essentially becomes as if it's here, not circumstantially, but attitudinally. And I'm quite convinced that these accounts of the world being a terrible place that, is going from bad to worse, are a result of a thinking about topics in a way that snowballs and creates an impression of life that includes so many dark patches in it. And if that thinking falls away, if we turn off some people that continually feed that type of description of life, if the TV gets turned off, if your own thinking manages just to slow down because you find yourself doing a job for 3 or 4 days that requires your attention, full attention, and you become absorbed in that work, you might realize that the present moment experience for a lot of people is actually devoid of so much of what is added in by thinking. Even if you live in a city, you can walk down to the street and walk out on the street and look at people and be amazed, say hello just to a stranger as you're walking. And that can replace some negative thinking, some view of life that isn't right here, right now. And if you were to walk into a park in New York City and you go to Hyde Park or Central Park, and as soon as you step into the park, there's trees all around you and nature is beautiful. Yet if your thinking brings in all of the thoughts of what is wrong with life, what the politicians are doing wrong, what is happening in other countries, what is going on with human rights, what your boss is doing to you or not doing, what your partner and friends are doing, all of that can come into your experience in the present moment. And what I'm suggesting is that we tend to have an experience that is what it is. And a lot of our experience are these additions into the present moment experience that are very much psychological additions. So when I say it's not my world, it could be someone could be living in the same place as me, in the same house as me. And their experience of life might be that life is terrible. And if I hear that, I think, wow, it's interesting. It's understandable even. But I say, but that's not the world I'm living in. And so I bring this up to try and highlight that our experience of life is not a standard thing that exists and is fundamentally problematic. Our experience of life is exactly that. It's the experience that is personal, that arises within us. In a sense, there is no world out there. There is just the subjective experience of life as it arises here. And so if the subjective experience is one filled with suffering, let's realize that is not because of life, not because of the other, but rather because of the attitude towards life. And the attitude towards life can be an attitude that is overly identified and attached to circumstance, and as a result, might be focusing on everything that is wrong. Not only everything that is wrong in your actual life, but everything that is presented as a concept, something that's seen on TV, and the attitude can grab onto that and turn that into the thing that is making life in general a problem. And as soon as it's turned off, if your intellect doesn't keep it alive, there is the possibility of suffering falling away. Now, I know what I'm saying will sound like you have to stop thinking a certain way, that suffering is a result of one's attitude. You have a negative attitude. If your attitude is attached to outcomes and you see yourself as the doer, then suffering is going to arise. So stop doing that. It's not saying that. It's describing dynamics that are impersonal dynamics. They are there, and they are the reason suffering is there is because the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is there. No one put that in place. It grew on its own, and it is functioning. The psychological identity grew, and the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome and the subsequent suffering is it functioning. So this is not an instruction to someone to stop functioning the way you are designed. That's not possible. This is information that essentially is new conditioning being delivered, that is specific conditioning that as it lands, if it lands, can bring about a seeing of dynamics that haven't been seen before. The new conditioning, if it becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning, can effectively shine light onto dynamics that may never have been seen before. Change will happen or not happen as a consequence of the light shining on things that haven't been seen before. It's not important for us to make the change. If the attitude kicks in and says, okay, I'm going to have to change my attitude. I've heard that that's what the problem is. That is the exact same attitude that needs to fall away. So what is the attitude that leads to suffering? The attitude is the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcomes. The attitude of personal doership doesn't recognize that we are growing and that we're not doing the growing process. We are the growing process. So the new conditioning is being delivered to the growing organism. And that becomes part of its growth without the organism consciously needing to incorporate the information. So essentially, it's like going out into the rain. You don't need to do the getting wet. It's like diving into a swimming pool. When you dive into the swimming pool, if we have an attitude that says, okay, so how do I do the wetting now? We're missing the point. The wetting has happened by the simple act of going outside or diving into the swimming pool. And the doership says, okay, so how do I realize I'm not the doer? How do I bring about the change? And change is always a result of the organ growing and growing into something different. So what do you have to do? You just turn up as a passenger aware of the growing instrument, aware of life. The change happens. Change doesn't require someone to make change happen. Change happens as a result of being in life. If our suffering is particularly intense, then what has probably set in life is a desperation. A desperation as a consequence of the uncomfortable feeling. And that desperation is another layer of the uncomfortable feeling. The desperation is, I must get rid of this. I must do something. I must understand something. I must resist this uncomfortableness. Now, that is just a consequence of the uncomfortableness being intense. Or it is a consequence of the belief in doership becoming so ingrained and believed as the only way that things change is by me doing something. Because we might say, well, how ridiculous. How can anything change if I don't change it? And it's strange that idea is built in. Why? Because we know that a big branch from a tree or a whole tree can fall. And when it falls onto a shed, it squashes the shed. And so when we go out and look at the shed, we see, oh, the shed is not as it was yesterday. The shed is now squashed. So change happened without a doer. Change is the nature, the impersonal nature of life. So the tree fell because of impersonal factors. the wind was strong, the structure of the growth in the trunk was compromised. Maybe termites got in, maybe fire weakened the tree. And as a combination of everything, essentially different forms of physics, a storm came through and wind blew the tree over, not because anyone did anything. There was no doer in the tree falling. So that is change, that is movement. The tree falls because of impersonal factors. The tree grows from a sapling to a big tree because of impersonal factors. There is no doer in the growth of a tree. And there is no doer in the squashing of the shed. It is purely physics, impersonal. And yet, what has happened with the human being is that the process of change, micro change, and the functioning of the human being moment after moment after moment has been interpreted by a belief, by a psychological identity that claims ownership over things that it isn't doing, claims ownership over movements, biological movements and psychological movements that are happening as a result of an instrument that has been grown by life, grown to function exactly the way it's functioning. And in a psychological me, which is just an idea, a deeply ingrained belief system that feels like a me doer, says, I did that. That was my thought. Now, what does it mean by my thought? It means mine belonging to this entity which is independent and separate, in control of whatever it thinks, feels, and does, as the orchestrator, as the one with volition. And that belief, that idea, is completely missing the fact that the tree fell because the wind blew it over. Completely missing the fact that the fridge was opened because hunger arose, a feeling arose, and the feeling arose and moved the body-mind organism towards the fridge. So if the tree had the capacity to think, the tree blown over by the wind, and then it says, oh, I shouldn't have done that. Or the tree formed, a leaf or a branch is formed on the tree, and it is formed in a way that's defective, that isn't following what would be considered the normal growth. And that's happening because of factors outside of the control of the tree. And yet if the tree could think, it might say, oh, I didn't do that very well. I shouldn't be very pleased with myself. And so that means that there is a psychological identity that the tree has developed, if the tree could think, that is missing the fact that the leaves form that way because of a blueprint that forced them to form that way, not because of any entity that had free will, volition, and control over how that happened. And the workings of the human is exactly the same. In principle, the workings of the human are that we function according to a design. And the outcomes happen because of the way we function. That is all interconnected. So we might think that we are improving a situation by taking something away that we might think is creating clutter or disturbing the appearance. And then we find that it was there for a very good reason. And in taking it away, something breaks. I did this. I did this once when I first came to the property I live on. It's a sort of semi-rural country property, and it's on a slope, and water runs from the top of the block, which is sloping for about 100 meters at quite a steep slope. And when I came, there are this road around the property, and there were these sort of bumps in the road. And so I got a tractor and I got rid of the bumps. Thought, oh, that's much better. Don't know why these bumps are there. And then the winter rains came, and the rains gouged out a sort of gully all the way from the top of the property down to the bottom of the property, because the water started running downhill and built up such a momentum that it eroded the ground and created these gullies. And so it's afterwards I realized, oh, those bumps were there specifically to prevent the water from building up speed and directing it into the bushland at specified intervals. And so after I had smoothed it all out originally, it's then I came to realize that there was a good reason for that. So I did the best I could at that point in time, thinking I was doing something useful. And in hindsight, it turned out that it wasn't very useful. And yet I was functioning according to my makeup, functioning a particular way. And then that had an effect because of the circumstance that I was part of, because of the environment that I was part of. And so the outcome is not in our control. Sometimes we get what we want. Sometimes we don't get what we want. And sometimes we get much more than what we want. So it is the attitude of personal doership, the attitude of attachment to outcomes, that forces the suffering to arise. And so these descriptions are not saying, okay, so change your attitude. They are descriptions that hopefully will change the attitude, not because you do the changing, but because the changing happens. And when our suffering is intense, there is a desperation, and that desperation is always trying to find a solution. So I would consider, especially to those where the suffering is intense, are you willing to consider that your suffering may never end? The suffering is a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. In part, the genes and up-to-date conditioning turn into the psychological identity, especially the up-to-date conditioning of doership and attachment to outcome. And that forces the suffering to arise. And then it forces the involvement in the suffering that tries to do something about it. The doing something about it is coming from the suffering root. The suffering itself is coming from the suffering root. And we look at that, the doer looks at the suffering and then says, oh, I should get rid of it. And the doer is the energy itself. And it feels like, oh, there is the suffering, and then there is me that might be able to do it, to get rid of it. And in seeking, the seeker often is the doership. the belief in personal doership, trying to improve the situation. So I suggest that if we understand that the energy of doership, the energy of attachment to outcomes, is the one that wants the suffering to stop. It is the suffering and the one that wants the suffering to stop. It is also the one that will try to stop trying to do something about the suffering. It is the one that will try to surrender to the suffering. That is the suffering energy. So whenever that comes up in response to suffering, understand that that is the suffering energy, and what you are is not that. And until we realize that those are expressions of the suffering energy, there is an identification with the one trying to fix the problem. And that's where we lose ourselves. We lose ourselves in the one that is desperate for. And what we are in essence is that which is potentially aware of that desperation for the suffering to end. And that which we are that is aware is silent. It is watching, not doing. It doesn't have the capacity to try and bring the suffering to the end, to an end. It is that which watches the suffering energy in its different forms. It's not that tries to watch the suffering energy. That which tries to watch the suffering energy is the suffering energy. It is not that which tries to resist the suffering energy. That which resists the suffering energy is the suffering energy. That which we are is silent and is witnessing, not trying to. That which is arguing with what is happening in life is the suffering energy. Thinking about the past is the suffering energy. That which is frustrated with the thinking about the past is the suffering energy. That which is frustrated about the arguing with what is going on in life is the suffering energy. Allow that to be there, to happen, understanding it comes from a deeply ingrained part of the system that has grown and been put in place. It makes sense that if things happened as part of the past when this entity was growing, things that maybe were extreme, it makes sense that this suffering is going to be there. So insisting that it's not is part of the suffering. And even that makes sense. That is what that suffering does. And you are not that. A hypnotization, hypnosis has happened. And as a result of that divine hypnosis, there has been a losing of ourself in. So to know that energy of suffering as a happening according to impersonal factors, to know that that makes sense, that is understandable, that is the way of life. Psychological identity in place, suffering must be there. To know that is normal means to allow it. To see a tree blowing in the wind is understandable. And so it can be witnessed as understandable, as normal. So the idea that happiness for the human being, the notion that happiness for the human being in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind is a description, it's a concept. It's not a concept for the doer to grab hold of and say, okay, thank you for telling me this. Now I must resist anything that is not peace of mind. I must push that away and bring in peace of mind. That movement is the suffering energy. If I were to describe to someone in prison a cafe that overlooks the sea where the sun is in, and you can have a great coffee while looking out over the ocean and seeing everyone walk past. That is a description of something that exists. Something that is theoretically available. But the person in prison may not have the opportunity, may not be entitled to that. So the description is valid as a description. If the person hearing it insists on it being their experience, then that's a different thing. So why is the description given? The description is given because if it is your destiny, it's important for the description to be there. But not such that it gets turned into an expectation. The outcome is not in our control. And ironically, if it's turned into an expectation, it means your destiny is not to receive what is described. Because turning the description into an outcome is turning the description into an attachment for that outcome is the suffering energy. And the peace of mind that is described is the end of suffering, the falling away of suffering. So many teachings won't describe enlightenment as the mind can get itself, it can wrap itself around. It won't describe enlightenment in such simple, practical terms, because those teachings understand that if we do that, the doership and attachment is going to turn it into an objective, and be undermining its own movement, be undermining its own dissolution. So the choice is to not describe liberation in practical terms. So why would another teaching, why would this teaching decide to do and describe exactly that which another teaching says that would be a very bad idea? Let me go to extreme lengths to not describe it in simple practical terms. And the reason is because, one, there are different teachings. There are many different methodologies that can get us to the same place. And two, because in this teaching, it recognizes that clarity for the working mind is important. And it also recognizes that the thinking mind will turn it into an expectation. And so we have an extra task to do in the teaching. One is describe it because it's important, and two, to point out that the likelihood is it will get turned into an expectation, and to counsel the seeker to be aware of that, which then means that if it's happening, a recognition of that might happen. So enlightenment is the end of suffering. Suffering is guilt, shame, pride, worry, and expectation. So be careful not to turn the description of the end of suffering into an expectation. If one does, what we'll see it manifest as is the resistance to primary suffering. And then maybe a resistance to the secondary suffering that is getting involved in the primary suffering. So if the primary suffering is there, understand it to be normal. If the resistance to the primary suffering is there, understand that to be normal. And allow it to be. See it as destiny unfolding. Okay, I think we'll open it up to some questions. Hello, Holger. How are you?
Hello, Roger. Roger, I'm very well. I thank you so much for your gentleness and depth and clarity. I mean, this is like breathing in so much freedom and joy just by listening to you. It's so many ticks. I mean, I can just tick off. Yesterday it was interesting. I felt guilty to just enjoy myself. I mean, it was such a beautiful day, and it was just interesting. Maybe this is what you said, the expectation of the end of suffering, that I, by accident, kind of was expecting that my suffering should drop away. But it's just so interesting to see this mechanism. Maybe it has to do with not feeling that I deserve so much peace.
Mm-hmm.
Is there such a thing?
Oh, yeah. We've come to understand life as suffering, and so the notion that it could be anything other than that can be incomprehensible. And sometimes if we get a glimpse that actually this is what is in store for you, or if we get a glimpse, this is what is in store for us, we can really break down in tears because it's so overwhelming. It's like being the one that is always not supported by family, by friends, and feeling that you're so used to that. And then one day someone comes in life and sees you in a tough situation and says, hey, let me help you. And they just keep helping. And that can be so overwhelming when someone only knows the absence of support. So yes, I think it can be that we have this deeply ingrained sense of unworthiness for anything other than mediocre. And that's part of the false sense of self, the false idea of life, the false attitude towards life, which results in a particular experience. And that can become, so standardized that anything else just isn't seen to be available. Isn't allowed, actually, because it may be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I'm speechless. Yes, thank you.
I had mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned it to you, but this experience in the Ramana cave that I had after speaking to someone with deep lack of self-worth. And it was a very interesting experience because I could, everything got shown in this vision. When Ramana came and, tapped me on the shoulder and said, God wants to see you. And this is Ramana, I have great respect for Ramana. And so in the vision, there was this character that was just sitting on the grass, sort of there, not particularly unhappy as far as I knew, but and Ramana was there sort of telling me God would like to see you. And there was no response. It was like, oh, okay, thanks for letting me know. It's like the information came in. God wants to see you. But it couldn't be processed as God wants to see. And after the third time, it was like, it clicked. It was like, oh, you're saying God wants to see me? Like, he wants to see me? That's bizarre. And in that moment when I realized that's what was being said for the 2 times before when it was repeated, and the system just couldn't hear that God wanted to see this entity. Why would God want to see this person? Of course, I am for God. And it was in that moment when I actually heard what was said, and so stood up to walk, to follow Ramana. So in that moment between the second time he said it and it wasn't heard, and the third time when it actually was heard, that's when I realized what shame does. Is it prevents us from being open to something that is right in front of us. It's like saying, you've won the lottery and you don't hear it. And it's like, well, you've won the lottery, but if you don't come and claim your prize, then it has to go to the next winner. And so they say, you've won the lottery and you don't get up to, collect your winnings because you can't hear it. It's like, of course, I didn't win the lottery. They must be talking about someone else.
And the lottery is just I am. I mean,
Yes.
Being in the moment and not escaping into projection, into thinking, into the past.
Indeed.
Wow, this is hallelujah. I mean, this is amazing, this whole thing. And also so wonderful with this word God, to how hard it is to just drop any idea and concepts and just be in this presence of this nothing. Because my whole life I was just so stuck in my thinking bubble, in my self-entertained identity, and then so filled with expectations and false values, and actually also a false sense of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so beautiful just to listen to the teaching and the way how you present it. And it gives me so many tools to just see my own traps, my own suffering, where I just created my own misery. I mean, this is so ridiculous. My whole life, I was just stuck in this false idea of this me. I mean, me as this little person needing to satisfy the expectations of my parents, of my surrounding. And I totally lost myself in this, in the suffering.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
total desperation. I mean, what a craziness. And but it couldn't, if I understand you correctly, it couldn't have been any other way.
Not at all. That's right. That's this story of life. Essentially, one way of describing what the story of life is, the plot of life, is that Source has turned into life. Source has turned into the human being, has forgotten itself, and is therefore forced to suffer. And then at some point, there is a remembering of oneself that starts to happen, which really means the falling away of the expectations and the way that we think we have to live life and our idea of what happiness is. So at some point, there is a remembering, and suffering comes to an end. So that's how I would describe the plot of this story, of forgetting oneself and suffering, and then at some point a remembering and suffering falling away. So if that's the plot, it can't be different. The suffering part can't be left out.
Yes. Oh, yeah, okay, good. Okay, I'm done. I see there are more hands now coming up. So thank you so much, Roger. Wonderful, deep gratitude. I mean, beyond words.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice. Hi, Lester. It's Roger. Oh, yes, I guess you know.
Hello?
Hello.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
What's up, my nigga? What's up? What's up?
Hi, Brian. Seemed like Lester got a bit carried away.
Hi, Roger. So I'm wondering about, you gave a description of resistance and how this might be undone. I'm wondering about, I feel it now, resistance in the body. And for me, this is manifested as a feeling of rejection, abandonment, and so nothing can be done about this.
Right.
I'm just wondering if you can give a description of how that might be processed by the body.
Right. Well, in the one way, there's lots that can be done about it. If you want to look at it a certain way, you can try to fix it, right, and resist it, etc. That is one attitude towards it. So, because on the one hand, when we say there's nothing you can do about it, what it really means is, well, it's pointing to what hopefully I'll get to here, is if you want to try and do something about it, go ahead. That's what we've been doing our whole life, essentially.
Yeah.
And it tends to just add an extra layer of uncomfortableness on top of the uncomfortableness. And so what is being pointed at is, so there's that attitude of trying to do it, trying to control it, trying to insist it's different, which I'm not saying that that doesn't make sense. It's completely understandable, because the uncomfortableness is uncomfortableness with oneself. And so the very nature is uncomfortableness, which is hard to sit with. It forces a resistance. And so when there is resistance, and that has become and that is the sort of assumed solution, it makes complete sense to me that that is what is happening, because intuitively it's not even about not doing anything about it, but just because of the nature of uncomfortableness, there is the movement to try and bring it to an end.
Yeah.
And that's why the concepts need to sort of just be heard, because otherwise it'll inspire a trying to bring it to an end, but maybe through the back door. So the same attitude will hear the concept and then, try and do that. So the concepts are really trying to just point out, if we are in resistance, it doesn't work. We've been doing it like that. We've been relating to suffering like that. And so if the description is heard and we go, yes, it's true. The uncomfortableness has been here, and the intuitive movement is to try and fix it. It feels counterintuitive to not try and fix it. And so if we've been trying to fix it and we see it doesn't work, then that description might hit us at some point and go, yeah, I agree. This isn't the way.
Yeah, it's this like
go on.
Yeah, it's this attempt to like wrestle with it and then not wrestle with it and sit with it, open to it. The teaching I come from, it's basically rest as the open space of awareness and just open. But that might be a description as well. So it's just
it is.
Yeah.
It's a description which you try to fulfill often, right? Or which we try to fulfill, because it says, once again, sit as the open space. So the doer tries to sit as the open space, whereas if that was to happen, it really is very much a happening that can be inspired by that concept, but only when the concept is held as as just a description.
Right. And do we have to come back to this concept? Because whether it's a happening, so it's a happening, not a doing, but there does seem to be like a natural movement back to the open space of awareness when that's when that movement is available.
Yeah, the concept can inspire that if the mechanics or the dynamics in the person have started to change. If the dynamics haven't really started to change, the concept is going to keep being heard as something I have to do. So that's why one of the descriptions is that, the suffering is a completely understandable byproduct of a certain structure that is in the human being, the psychological structure, and that you didn't put the structure in place, you don't control it, and you don't create its functioning, which really means the structure is there, the suffering is there, and there's nothing for you to do about it. So that can actually, if it doesn't create huge despair, which it could if the psychological identity hears it, but if it doesn't, then what it could inspire is a a stopping. It can inspire a different relationship to the suffering, because it's basically describing the suffering just like a fire. It's saying, well, the fire is there and you aren't creating fire, and you don't have the capacity to turn the fire out. So if that's heard, and if it's received and it feels right on some level, then what might happen is just the passive awareness of the fire, which may be a new movement compared to what has always taken place when the fire is present, which is an involvement in the fire to try and put it out, to change it, whatever. And so this is saying, actually, the fire is, it's almost like it's in a box, covered by perspex screens, and you don't have access to it. So don't keep trying to smash into the perspex screens to try and put the fire out. You just don't have access to the fire. You don't have the capacity. So stop.
Yeah, so what is seen is that every single attempt is just engenders another cycle of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And those cycles always return and might drop away when I'm with a teacher or naturally, and then it comes back and plays out again.
Mm-hmm. Because that identity that is the various beliefs, the psychological identity, doesn't get dissolved in one go. And the process of the suffering falling away for a period of time is part of the process of the identity being dissolved, but it doesn't happen the way we expect. We sort of want it to one day just fall away.
Yeah.
And when it comes back, we think, oh, it didn't work. Maybe next time. But maybe we can look at it as a process of a bit like that game Jenga, where you're pulling out bits, one at a time, and at some point the thing collapses. And the process can be like that. It is a slow process of collapse. And at the times when we think nothing's happening, maybe something is happening.
Yeah, it seems completely beyond what I understand, but it also seems like there's like the opportunity to get out of the way, so to speak, and be in the way and create this like keep this cycle of suffering going. But maybe then that is also just a happening necessary for, or it's like what you're saying, I suppose, is who knows, and don't worry about it.
Yeah, well, if the involvement keeps happening, then I would say it's destiny and it's unavoidable. It does mean it's perpetuating suffering, but that doesn't mean you should stop doing it, because if it's happening, it's because of the makeup. So what I'm saying is not, I'm not talking for the sake of it, in the sense that, oh, there's nothing for us to do, so, well, let me say something because otherwise we'll be silent. But really, whether we're silent or we say anything, it doesn't make a difference. The descriptions they're new conditioning, and the new conditioning has the potential or will change your up-to-date conditioning. And So I think the most significant thing that can be said in relation to this conversation is the suffering as a result of the makeup that you didn't put in place and you don't have the capacity to change. So next time the suffering is there, something in you might watch the suffering in the same way as you might watch a pain in your thigh. If there's a pain in your thigh, knowing that, well, the pain in your thigh has got to do with complex biology, and you aren't creating the pain in your thigh. So you can just be aware of it as a pain. And in the same way, you might be able to, because of the description that has said, the suffering is not something you're creating, it's something that is arising, and it will subside in its own time. And therefore, this getting out of the way can happen just because the system has been equipped with that description.
And so that would also stop the movement of identifying with this surface level of experience and
it
sensation
will
thoughts.
It will if it's received a certain way, but I'm not in control of how it's received, and the receiving body-mind organism isn't in control of how it's received. So if it's received a certain way, the system will say, we'll see, okay, yeah, the suffering is happening. It may realize I'm not creating the suffering, it's there, and I've had enough experience to know that I can't bring the suffering to an end. And so then its only option is to just witness the suffering, which really means non-involvement. It's neither resisting the suffering and pushing it away or embracing the suffering. It's outside of embracing the suffering or pushing the suffering away. So that may help us realize it's about being still, really. It's about the doer dissolving, because the doer wants to push it away, or it's heard, you have to stop pushing away your suffering and embrace it. And the embracing it really means is there. Teachings will say embrace your suffering, because they know that the intuitive movement is to push the suffering away. So it says embrace it, to try and break the movement of pushing suffering away. However, if we can say it's not about embracing or about resisting, and that may make it clear that it's about witnessing the suffering in a silent way.
Right. And so it's interesting because there are moments of like immense silence, and then the mind tries to get a hold of it. And obviously, I forgot what I was going to say.
Even that movement of the mind getting hold of it can be witnessed, right? So you can witness yourself. You can witness that there can be the suffering, then there can be the witnessing of a resistance of the suffering.
Yeah.
Because that resistance of the suffering is inevitable sometimes, often. And there's always something that is not that. Not the suffering, not the resistance of the suffering, not the embracing of the suffering, something that is much less involved. And even there's something that is witnessing the mind trying to be the witness. If the mind is trying to be the witness, there is something that can witness that.
Yeah, it's what floats it. It seems like is just thinking coming in, narratives coming in, and those being believed, and perpetuating whatever the feelings in the body are and perceiving that as reality, like, for me, for a me.
Yeah. And perceiving it as who I am, you know, that who I am is the one that has to think about this, the one that has to, you know, resist this. And we've completely lost track of the one that we are that is beyond all of that. That doesn't mean that, in fact, to know the one that is beyond all of that doesn't mean to stop the involvement. That the involvement is fine, because that's just another layer of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And what we need is to realize what all the layers of suffering look like, because that's when there can be an awakening to the fact, oh, I'm not that. I've always felt myself to be that, the one that has to resist the suffering and think about the suffering. So you're right. What you describe is what we have come to know ourselves as, which is really this psychological involvement. And therefore we have forgotten the essence that we are, which is not at all involved, but rather that which is aware of the involvement. And we can't do that aspect of ourselves. That aspect of ourself pops out when we start watching that aspect that isn't what we are, that we have always believed ourselves to be, which is that involvement, trying to fix things, trying to imagine the future, trying to look back at the past. And that's not what we are. We are that which is aware of all of that movement.
Yeah, because it doesn't drop away, even if it's seen that it causes suffering and that no solution ever comes or has come of it, of thinking and getting lost in.
What was the first part? It will, or it, what was the first part of that statement?
Well,
It won't.
It won't drop away just because
Not
there's like a recognition that, you know, it engenders suffering.
not necessarily, but if there is a recognition of that, that is a very significant thing. So our shift should be away from outcomes, and more being impressed or interested in seeing what is, which means understanding that, oh, you know, my efforts to try and get rid of it are just another layer of suffering. When there is a witnessing of it and no involvement in trying to get rid of it, that doesn't mean that the primary suffering is going to go away. But then what you'll see is, oh, but the secondary suffering has fallen away. If there is a witnessing of the primary suffering, because the alternative is we either witness the primary suffering or there is an involvement in the primary suffering.
Yeah.
There can't be both. If there is a witnessing and the primary suffering and the secondary suffering, then it means that there's no tertiary suffering, because the primary suffering and the secondary suffering are being seen. So rather than doing it in order to get an outcome, it's much more important to see what is happening, the outcome being irrelevant. And one thing we notice is that if there is a watching, which really means an awareness of the various layers of suffering, like seeing, okay, there's suffering about the circumstance, and then there's suffering about the fact that there's suffering. If those layers can be seen, then you exist as the one seeing the two layers of suffering. The fact that there's two layers of suffering there, that's just destiny. So this teaching says destiny will unfold in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold. And so that description may allow us to rest with the suffering because we might realize, oh, it's my expectation that wants there to be no suffering in this moment. But destiny is what destiny is. And so that too can help create a silence in place of the insistence of things being different.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Could you hear me?
Oh, now I can hear you, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I said thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks for dropping in.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. I think we'll have one more question. Hello, Monica.
Hi, Roger. So my question is, I wonder if you have a pointer or a description of the witnessing of very subtle forms of suffering that are almost unidentifiable as suffering. Where, so for example, if there's acute suffering or very clear suffering with a very clear cause that can be followed from the perception to the feeling in the body, the thought form, all the way to, yeah, all that, that's relatively easy. I mean, not easy, but clear. But there's a form of suffering that I contemplate lately that kind of dissipates when it's there, but dissipates when it's investigated in a way, and that it leaves this feeling or perception or experience of insubstantiality, but yet it's still there. So somehow it can't be really grasped. Well, there's nobody to grasp it anyway, but still it's a conundrum. It's somehow a slippery little angle there. So
what comes to mind is do you know specifically what that suffering is?
No, and that's what it is, because once I know, it goes away in general. So it can't be labeled. It can be I almost, jokingly thought that it's the suffering of the witness itself.
Yeah. So what comes to mind is a layer of boredom is one form of it. And how that presents is if someone says, if either they're recounting it to me or you'll have the experience of it yourself, is that, I'm witnessing life. The witnessing is happening, but it doesn't seem particularly satisfying. It's flat, or it's boring. And so my response to that is, then if that's the feeling, and I know that there is this range of experience that doesn't have anything acute in it, doesn't have any particularly painful circumstance or extreme circumstance, it doesn't have any palpable suffering, and yet there is this sort of flatness, and the flatness seems to seems to be there with what we assume is witnessing. And my response is, okay, so the important thing to know is that isn't witnessing, because if it was witnessing, the feedback that is coming forward, which is, it doesn't feel particularly satisfying, it doesn't feel contenting, it feels flat, that feedback wouldn't. So the assumption then must be there is a layer of suffering, And it's probably linked to attachment to outcome, attachment to pleasure. And so because the situation is quite mundane, nothing particularly good or bad, it's unsatisfying because there is an expectation, a historic expectation, like an ingrained expectation for life to be felt as good, like some sort of pleasure. Does that, so you don't have to agree necessarily that it is an expectation or whatever, but this description of life feeling flat when there's nothing particularly positive or negative, no particular suffering, is that in line with what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so. I think that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering about it. It feels like an indifference. Not a. I mean, not that I don't care about. I'm still involved, and pleasure and pain is there, and so there's a lot of satisfaction, I would say, in the mundane activities overall. But there's also an indifference. So it seems that there's an indifference towards outcome. But hearing you, maybe that's the angle that, not maybe, definitely that's the angle that needs to be investigated, where there's some other expectation there, where the overt felt feeling of indifference is just a superficial layer, and there's some expectation there that hasn't been investigated.
Yeah. Remember, expectation can transfer into the counter opposite, where our expectation starts off being one of attachment, and then we can sort of force ourselves into an expectation of renunciation, in a way, of non-involvement, non-participation in pleasure and pain. And if it swings from being overly excited and involved and in pleasure and pain being there, which is the typical attachment, as part of the dissolving that, we can sort of move to what attitudinally is a renouncing of pleasure, like thinking pleasure and pain is not good. I have to stay away from them. And that could be a form of attachment in its opposite form.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. It doesn't feel that I don't think I'm staying away from, definitely not pleasure, maybe from pain. But the boredom part, I think that's something I didn't think about. So I'll sit with that. Yeah, everything that you said resonated. So.
Okay, and so when it's this fine layer, it isn't necessarily about you seeing it and it falling away. What you can intellectually understand it as is, okay, so if there's a remnant, like the remnants of the psychological identity that has been largely dissolved, but then there are still some bits, then we know that that is going to infect, in a way, the peace of mind. And what we're going to experience is this layer of suffering. And it may just be that stops over time, including the recognition that, okay, so that's what this experience is when it's there, and say it lasts for 2 days. And then there's, if another experience comes in, the experience where there is peace of mind without that fine layer of suffering, and you then in that moment you go, now this doesn't have that doubt in it. There is no doubt in this. There's nothing particularly exciting happening in life, but it feels completely enough. And so then you have the experience that you can compare to the 2 days before, let's say, where there was a doubt, and then okay, so that doubt is a layer of suffering. And so you don't really need to necessarily see it any more than that. You just understand, yes, there's a layer of suffering, and the layer of suffering comes because the psychological identity is still there to some extent. I know that I didn't put the psychological identity in place. I know that life is getting rid of it. So when the doubt is there, when the boredom is there, it's just part of the unfolding circumstance, and let it be. And obviously that means that the attitude of non-doership is sinking in deeper, because there's non-doership with that that doubt or that boredom. And the non-doership with the doubt or the boredom comes when we just simply see it for what it is, a layer of suffering that is not so intense, but definitely dampens down the peace of mind. And that's enough for us. Often we can go, well, it's there and it'll go if it's going to go.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, thank you, everyone. Till next time. Peace.